There comes a moment in every woman's life where she pauses and looks at herself, not just in the mirror, but deeper in the quiet corners of her mind, and wonders where that radiant, alive, magnetic version of herself is gone. The one who used to feel her hips sway with rhythm, who used to smile at her reflection, who used to feel the soft stirrings of desire bloom just from a passing thought or a tender moment of intimacy. And as the years go by and routines settle in and bodies change in shape and rhythm, and hair turns silver and skin takes on the texture of wisdom, that feeling of vitality and sensuality often begins to fade into the background. Not because she is no longer a sensual being, but because no one ever told her that she still has permission to be one. And that feeling sexy and alive after 60 is not about pretending to be young again, not about fitting into old dresses or chasing an illusion of youth, but about reconnecting with the parts of herself that have been quietly waiting for her to turn inward again, to rediscover what makes her feel beautiful, wanted, radiant, not for someone else's gaze, but for her own joy. And the most powerful, transformative act she can do each day to reignite that inner flame is something so simple, so intuitive, and yet so often forgotten. It is the daily ritual of intentional self-touch, not in a sexual way at first, though it may lead there, but in a sacred, sensory, nurturing way that says to the body, I see you, I feel you, I still cherish you. Because so many women go years, even decades, without truly touching themselves with love, with curiosity, with reverence, and yet the body remembers. It remembers what it's like to be cherished, to be explored, to be touched without judgment. And when a woman begins to reintroduce that language of touch, even if it's just placing her hands gently on her chest each morning, or massaging lotion into her thighs with care rather than haste or softly, tracing the lines of her face with appreciation rather than critique, something begins to awaken in her. Not because the act is dramatic, but because the intention behind it breaks through years of silence, of numbness, of neglect. And this one daily practice can shift everything. How she carries herself, how she speaks, how she receives attention, how she sleeps, how she breathes, how she dreams. Because the act of reconnecting with her own physicality reminds her that she is not just a mind floating through time, but a body filled with sensations, stories, longings, and unspent energy that deserves to move, to feel, to come alive again. And the truth is, sensuality doesn't disappear with age. It simply changes form, becomes more nuanced, more tender, more profound. And sometimes all it takes is one loving moment of daily self-contact to open the door to it again. And when that door opens, the world begins to look different. Food tastes richer, music sounds deeper, colors seem more vivid, and relationships take on a new texture. Because when a woman begins to treat her own body as a living, breathing, feeling temple of experience rather than a problem to be hidden or fixed, she reclaims her power, her softness, her fierce, graceful femininity. And this daily act of touch doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be done after a shower, during a quiet moment before bed, while listening to music, or even during moments of grief or stress when the body feels heavy or foreign. Because especially in those moments, the touch becomes medicine, a bridge between the self she once was and the self she is becoming. And over time, this small ritual begins to rebuild a relationship with the body that is based on presence and pleasure rather than judgment and withdrawal. And she may begin to notice changes, subtle at first, like a spark of warmth in her belly when she smiles, or a tingling in her fingertips when she moisturizes her skin, or a sudden urge to dance when a familiar song comes on. And eventually these moments grow, string together, become a rhythm, a pulse, a quiet anthem of I am still here, I'm still alive, I still deserve to feel beautiful. And this reclamation begins to affect her interactions with others too. Not because she's trying to seduce, but because her energy shifts, becomes more open, more inviting, more radiant in a way that cannot be faked or manufactured because it comes from within. And people notice, friends, strangers, even. Her own reflection begins to meet her with more warmth. And what's truly astonishing is how this one act of daily self-touch begins to ripple out into every corner of her life. Her health improves, her sleep deepens, her confidence grows, her creativity returns, her laughter becomes fuller, her desires return not just in the bedroom, but in the kitchen, the garden, the pages of her journal. Because she is no longer living in a shell of expectation, she is living from the inside out, connected to her senses, to her breath, to her pulse. And while some may dismiss this as vanity or indulgence, the truth is that this is radical self-care, the kind that heals decades of body shame, of quiet suffering, of cultural erasure, and replaces them with reverence, pleasure, and wholeness. And what's more, this practice can begin at any age. It is never too late to come home to your body, to your sensual wisdom, to your own hands. And in doing so, you create a daily reminder that you're not done yet. Not with joy, not with beauty, not with connection, and especially not with desire. And once this daily ritual of self-touch begins to anchor itself in her routine, not as an obligation, not as another thing to check off, but as a quiet, sacred return to her own body, a woman over 60 may begin to notice how the relationship with herself changes in small but powerful ways. Because it's not just about the physical act of applying lotion or feeling the texture of her skin under her fingertips. It's about the energy with which she approaches it, the intention behind the act that shifts it from mundane to magical, from routine to ritual. And what makes this practice even more profound is that the longer she commits to it, the more she begins to heal parts of herself that were never given space to breathe, parts that were silenced by a culture that taught her from a young age that her body was only valuable when it was young, firm, smooth, fertile, or pleasing to someone else's eye. And those lessons, those insidious beliefs, don't just vanish with time. They burrow deep, affecting how she stands, how she breathes, how she lets herself be seen or not seen, how she receives love, and how she experiences pleasure. And unless they are addressed, unless they are brought gently into the light, they can form a quiet barrier that keeps her from fully inhabiting her body even decades later. But this one daily act of self-touch begins to erode that barrier, not all at once, but gently like water shaping stone. Because when she pauses each day to touch her own arms, her belly, her thighs, her chest, with love and presence, she sends a message deeper than words, a message that says, this body is still mine, this body is still beautiful, this body still belongs to me. And that message begins to shift how she carries herself in the world, how she speaks, how she moves, how she meets a reflection. And that shift becomes visible in ways that can't be hidden, because something in her begins to glow again, not because she's wearing more makeup or dressing differently, but because she's remembering herself, reconnecting to that deep well of feminine energy that never left her, only dimmed with disuse. And what's more, this practice has the power to affect not just how she feels, but how her brain works, how her hormones balance, how her nervous system calms. Because the skin is not just a surface, it's a gateway to the entire body's communication network, filled with receptors that send messages of safety, pleasure, and connection back to the brain. And when those messages become daily rather than rare, the whole system begins to regulate. And from that regulation comes a renewed sense of aliveness, of vitality, of being grounded in oneself. And as this aliveness builds, it begins to restore things that many women thought were lost forever. Things like spontaneous desire, natural lubrication, warmth in the pelvic area, excitement at the thought of touch or closeness, and even playful curiosity about sensuality itself. Because once the body feels safe, it begins to open, and once it opens, it remembers how to feel pleasure again. And this is why this daily practice matters so deeply. It's not about grooming or maintenance or vanity. It's about reclaiming ownership, reconnecting with the flow of energy that moves through the body when it's treated not as an object, but as a sacred vessel of sensation and experience. And that reconnection becomes a foundation for everything else, for how she approaches intimacy with others, for how she speaks about her desires, for how she navigates aging not as a slow decline, but as a continued unfolding. And this one simple practice becomes a way of rewriting the story of aging, of sexuality, of womanhood itself, because for too long, older women have been told they are invisible, irrelevant, dried up, or done. And these messages don't just come from magazines or movies. They come from doctors who don't ask about pleasure, from partners who no longer reach for them, from family who only sees them in caretaking roles, from media that only celebrates youth. And yet, deep down, every woman knows that something is missing in that narrative, something vital, something sacred. And when she begins to touch her own skin with love each day, she begins to write a new story, one where she's still sensual, still vibrant, still capable of desire and joy and erotic delight, not despite her age, but because of it, because only now does she know her body so well, only now does she understand the nuance of arousal, the pleasure of slowing down, the beauty of being present with sensation without rushing to a goal. And in this knowing, in this presence, she discovers a form of sensuality that is deeper and more lasting than anything she knew in her younger years. And this is the gift of age, not a fading of beauty, but a refinement of it, not a loss of sexuality, but a transformation of it into something more personal, more empowered, more attuned to the rhythms of her own heart and body. And every time she returns to this practice, every time she places her hands on her own skin and breathes, she is saying to herself and to the world, I am still here. I still matter. My body is still worthy of love, of touch, of pleasure. And that message begins to change everything from the inside out. And as this quiet, daily act becomes more familiar, no longer something that feels foreign or uncertain, but something she looks forward to, something that grounds her, nourishes her, centers her in the moment. She starts to notice the way her own hands have become trusted guides back to herself, the way her own touch begins to reawaken long-forgotten sensations, not just physical ones, but emotional textures too, subtle pulses of warmth, memories, forgotten hungers, a sense of homecoming in her own skin. And what once may have felt like a chore or a stretch of the imagination now becomes an intimate conversation, a language spoken not in words but in sensation, breath, warmth, and presence. And with each passing day, she rediscovers the beauty of slowing down, of exploring her body not for someone else's satisfaction, but to rediscover what it means to be a woman who is alive, curious, sensual, and whole in her own right. And as this connection grows, her entire sense of femininity begins to shift, not backward toward the person she once was, but forward into someone more grounded, more complete, more radiant from within, because she's no longer waiting for someone else to validate her desirability, no longer depending on external compliments or attention to feel worthy, She is generating that feeling from inside herself, building it from the raw, unpolished truth of daily presence. And that kind of radiance cannot be bought, painted on, or performed. It emerges naturally. When a woman stops apologizing for her age, stops hiding her belly, her thighs, her soft skin, and instead touches them lovingly, as sacred evidence of a life well lived, of battles survived, of decades of laughter and loss and resilience held in the soft folds of her body. And this shift spills over into the way she walks in her rooms, into the way she meets people's eyes, into the way she carries herself not with arrogance, but with an ease that says, I know who I am, and I like her. And that sense of self is magnetic, not in the way youth once was, with its sharp edges and bright flames, but like a hearth fire, warm, steady, glowing from the inside out, and people around her begin to feel that warmth. Not because she's trying to get attention, but because she has become a lighthouse for those who have been lost in the fog of shame, aging, invisibility, and silence. And what's even more powerful is how this simple act of daily self-touch begins to transform not only her relationship with herself, but with others. Because once she reconnects with her own pleasure, with her own rhythm, with her own body's quiet needs and delights, she becomes more available for connection, for intimacy that is rooted in truth rather than obligation, for conversations about desire that are open and unafraid, for experiences that prioritize depth over performance. Because she is no longer trying to keep up with outdated standards or act out someone else's fantasy. She's finally living in her own story with her own voice. And that is where true sensuality lives, not in the ability to please another, but in the willingness to please herself. And in that space, she may find that desire returns not as a flicker, but as a slow-burning flame, one that grows with attention, with care, with permission to feel without rushing, without judging, and she might start to explore other practices that support this awakening. Gentle movement like yoga or dancing in her living room, breath work that softens her nervous system, sensual baths with oils and music that make her feel held and beautiful, clothing that feels soft against her skin or makes her smile when she sees herself. And she might start to write in a journal again, not just about thoughts, but about sensations, about the way her body responds to different textures, temperatures, times of day. And in doing so, she becomes her own lover, her own witness, her own mirror of devotion. And this is not selfish, it is sacred, because from that place of self-intimacy, every other relationship becomes clearer, more honest, more alive. And whether she is single, partnered, widowed, or divorced, this return to herself becomes the foundation from which all other connections can grow, because she is no longer lost in someone else's definition of beauty or desirability, no longer trying to squeeze herself into a role that doesn't fit anymore, no longer afraid of her own softness, her own lines, her own evolving sensuality. And as she touches her skin each day, whether it's her arms, her collarbone, her face, her thighs, or her heart, she breathes a little deeper, walks a little taller, and lives a little more freely, because this ritual is not about vanity or sexuality alone. It is about presence, about ownership, about claiming her body as a place of power and peace and possibility. And the more she honors that, the more her life becomes infused with color, with taste, with movement, with desire. Not just the desire for sex, but the desire to live fully, to feel deeply, to age boldly, and to break free from the quiet cages so many women are placed in after a certain number of birthdays. And in doing so, she becomes a force not loud, not demanding, but steady and undeniable, a woman who knows herself, who loves herself, and who refuses to shrink. And it all begins with one act each day. One moment of touch, one breath of connection, one commitment to show up for herself, not because she must, but because she can. And with each passing day that she chooses to return to herself, with each breath that carries her deeper into her body, with each gentle press of her fingertips reminding her that she is still worthy of feeling cherished, something begins to shift on a deeper level, something that no makeup, no clothing, no external affirmation could ever create, because what she's doing is reuniting with her essence, with the most primal, intuitive, feminine core of herself that has always known how to feel, how to receive, how to radiate, and how to love. And this reunion becomes more than a habit. It becomes a devotion, a declaration that says, I'm not invisible, I am not forgotten, I am not irrelevant, I am here, I am vibrant, and I still carry the capacity for beauty, for touch, for sacred sensuality that is not defined by age, but by awareness, by tenderness, by self-respect. And when she moves through her day now, she carries that awareness with her like a fragrance, subtle but unmistakable. And others begin to feel it too. Not because she's performing or trying to be noticed, but because her energy has changed, softened yet strengthened, and now, instead of hiding or bracing against the world, she opens, she welcomes, she engages, and the joy of it is that this newfound confidence and connection don't just live in the private space of her bedroom or her mirror, they ripple out into everything. Into the way she shops for fruit at the market, the way she chats with a neighbor, the way she wraps a scarf around her shoulders or runs her fingers through her hair, because this sense of being sensual and alive is not something compartmentalized or reserved for rare moments. It becomes woven into the fabric of her daily life, and the more she honors that fabric, the more luxurious, comforting, and empowering it becomes. And in time, she might find herself craving more of this inner intimacy, not just as a routine, but as a path of self-discovery, maybe even expanding into other expressions, perhaps through gentle movement that awakens her hips, through breath that opens her chest, through journaling that captures the whispers of her body's wisdom, through water rituals that make her skin tingle with remembrance, through music that stirs something inside her long believed to be asleep, and all of it, every bit of it, becomes part of her sensual revival. And in that revival, she doesn't just reclaim pleasure. She reclaims presence. She reclaims passion. She reclaims her right to be fully here in this stage of life. Not as a diminished version of who she once was, but as a more complete version of who she's always been becoming. And maybe for the first time in years, she allows herself to be seen. Not just with clothes and smiles, but with her whole self, her softness, her truth, her longing, her joy, her depth, her stillness, and her fire. Because feeling sexy and alive again isn't about changing her body. It's about changing her relationship to her body, seeing it not as something broken or past its prime, but as something exquisitely alive, responsive, wise, and deserving of adoration. And she doesn't need to wait for anyone else to give her that adoration, because it begins with her own hands, her own gaze, her own breath, her own decision to return again and again to that daily sacred act that started it all. Just one touch, just one moment, just one small permission to be here, to feel, to breathe, to bloom again. And the beauty of it all is that it's never too late to begin, never too late to awaken, never too late to experience this deep and beautiful reconnection with the self. Because whether she's 60, 70, 80, or beyond, the truth remains unchanged. She is still a woman, she is still sensual, she is still powerful, and she is still worthy of experiencing not just the softness of touch, but the fire of joy, not just the peace of presence, but the pleasure of embodiment. And in choosing this practice each day, she gives herself the greatest gift, Not just a feeling sexy or desirable, but a feeling truly alive again, rooted in herself, lit from within, held by her own hands, and completely, beautifully, and unapologetically whole.